Hello. I'm delighted to meet so many fellow Welsh lovers and Welsh people who are interested in culture and literature. It was really a delight to find the Great Plains Center here in Nebraska. I wasn't aware when I moved here that there even was such a thing. So, I will be talking today about Welsh storytelling, the earliest Welsh storytelling. If I can get my screen up here. There we go. Okay. So, talking about Welsh storytelling, I really want to go to the earliest history of Welsh language and Welsh literature, which hopefully will not surprise many of you, but the Welsh language has been evolving from the common Celtic languages for thousands of years. It is, in fact, one of the oldest still living and spoken languages in Europe. So anybody who tells you that Welsh is new or that Welsh hasn't been around as long as, say, Latin or Greek, that's just wrong. Welsh has a very long and distinctive history um, of literary development, of a strong literary culture, and it's something I think we all should be very proud of and aware of. The Celts are actually described by Julius Caesar in his Gallic Wars when they came and raided in Rome itself. The Celts were the most powerful tribe in what we consider Central Europe now. And they got all the way down to Rome. They didn't quite win, but Caesar describes them in their first written description as being fierce, slingshot wielding warriors, and that they brought with them Druid priests who allegedly practiced human sacrifice. Um, the Celts riding into Rome honestly struck terror into their hearts. They were said to ride naked, but covered with body paint on their face and clay and paint put into their hair to make it spiky. And then the only thing they had on their waists were belts containing shrunken heads of the enemies that they slayed. So you can imagine riding into the streets of Rome um, looking very fierce with a reputation of warriors and magic and sacrifice. They would have sent most people scurrying for the hills. Um, the word Wales comes from an Old English word, wale, which means stripe, and it's used throughout Old English as meaning slaves or foreigners. So when the English started running into the Welsh, they considered them foreigners or people who were less genteel or cultured than they were. Now we're talking about the English, Angles, Saxons, barbaric Germanic tribes. Um, so that Wales was never a name that the Welsh used for themselves or their language. The earliest Welsh that we know of called themselves Cymru, as they still do. And they called their land Ynys Prydain, or the Isle of the Mighty, with themselves, the native Britons, being the mighty. Celtic societies had professional bardic schools. They actually had bardic grammars with all the rules and requirements to become a certified bard or poet in Celtic lands. This happened both in Wales and in Ireland. Um, Often people were thought to have this kind of talent and ability come through their genetics. So if you had a parent or a close relation who had the gift of poetry, often you would be put as a young child into one of these bardic schools. Other people who noticed that their children were especially bright and capable, or that they were able to memorize many things, good with words, they would apply for admission to the Bardic schools as well. The training often lasted longer than 20 years. You had to learn the history of your country and your tribe, all the different meters that were used in the poetry, all the different styles, how to perform, how to play a musical instrument, what the customs were of your country. Um, Bards were really the highest level of society. They were allowed to speak freely to the king as an advisor. And they really were members of the priestly class, although this was largely in pre-Christian times. Um, they were religious leaders. They were judge and jury when there was a disagreement in the tribe. They would give direction based on history or custom about how things should be resolved. They had to memorize all of the genealogy of their tribe because the way the Welsh divided property was among all their sons equally, including their illegitimate sons. So all of the family connections needed to be memorized and able to bring forth by the bards or poets in the culture. Um, so you can imagine if you had a child who maybe had this capability, it would be a great honor to be made a bard and be able to go and speak for your people, to advise the king or ruler, to even have control of magical forces. Oftentimes, a bard would be taken to war so that he could rally his troops with words, also so that he could demoralize the enemy using certain satires and poetry. They were even known to be able to change the weather to favor their own side and sometimes command nature to assault the enemy army, for example, birds or mud or trees. They really had control of the natural world through their knowledge of words. So they could be judges, they could be storytellers, but they could also be myth makers. And a lot of the stories that have come down to us from the early period were set in writing by bards. Um, they were normally associated with patrons in the Middle Ages. You wanted to get the highest level of patron you could, because if they had more power, you would have more influence, you would probably be paid better, you would have nicer surroundings. So you pretty much wanted to attach yourself to the highest lord you could. And they served later in the Middle Ages as court poets. They would write the stories of their lord's achievements, the battles he won, his nobility, his generosity, his Christianity. All these things would be written down for the generations to come. They would also write eulogies when the Lord would die or his family members would die. So a lot of the early poetry we see is this type of poetry, either praise poetry or elegiac poetry, talking about the great loss, memories of heroes lost in battle or in other ways. So really, the bards wrote history. What we know about the history of early Wales was written by these poets. All the historical figures we know about, all of this came down through the words of these highly trained poets. Even the first mentions of King Arthur, which became the most important theme of literature across the Middle Ages, all the way around Europe. came from Welsh poets, as we'll see in a bit. The weapon of a medieval bard was satire, and the satire could be cutting. It often had to do with a lack of generosity. If a lord wasn't generous to a bard, didn't provide him with good food, a good room, payment, the Lord could expect to have satire written about him. And not only would this be shared and kind of sully his reputation, but in some cases, it could even cause him to lose his money, his power, his influence, and it could even cause him to lose his life. So bards were highly respected, somewhat feared, and generally treated very well. So going back to Indo-European culture, if we look at this map, the kind of blank spot in the middle, right above the sea, you can see all the arrows emanating out of it. That is where the cultures from the steppes lived in around 5000 BC. And that is where all Eurasian culture came from. All of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and then much of the Indic Peninsula, much of Russia, all came from this original cultural group. And the first way we found out about that was through language. Welsh and Irish are actually linked to Sanskrit in India, to Greek and Latin in those areas. These were all the classical languages in 1000 BC, around the time of Christ. They're all on the same level of separation from the original Proto-Indo-European language. So scholars started noticing these similarities between the Indian language and the Welsh language. And then they started noticing that they also had some cultural similarities, the kind of pottery they made, the kind of stories they told, the kind of organization they had in their society. And then they started looking at the stories, and the stories are so, so similar. And so they began to realize that Indo-European culture really was the whole of Europe. And they have so many similarities. And then they found out that this was actually fact about 20, 30 years ago through genetic testing. So they can genetically test people who come from all of this range and find that they do share a similar genetic history. So the main thing I think is interesting is that Welsh literature is on the same cultural developmental level as Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, which are considered classical languages. Welsh should be considered of equal value and historical relevance as those languages. And Welsh literature is as developed, as sophisticated, as important as these other cultural heritages, I guess. Welsh just isn't spoken as much and it isn't taught as much. That's what we're all here for. So the early poets are called the Cynvair, which means the early poets. They wrote from about 500 to 1100 AD, basically from the fall of Rome. Rome invaded England and Wales, some part of them. And when the barbarian Germanic tribes came and knocked out the English people, the Roman and Welsh people remained in Wales untouched. So they continued to develop their poetry and their culture from 500 on without that whole Dark Ages problem that was going on in England, where they kind of lost their Christianity, their literary development, changed their language. So the early poets wrote about nature. They wrote about religion. They were very Christian, very devout. They wrote praise poetry for their patrons and their friends, for their local heroes. And they attended the bardic schools and also trained up and coming bards through, um, actually, there are bardic grammar books, but generally they would do observation and teach them how to do poetry and all the correct meters. A little bit later on, we have the poets of the princes, who are called Bear the Tawasogion or Gogunvaird. Gogunvaird means a little bit less early poets. 1100 to 1300. And this is pretty much the high Middle Ages. It's when everything was going great. The economy was good, populations growing. There was the warm weather period that meant crops were very successful. So this has a lot of poetry in this period, a lot of patronages. Even very minor barons wanted to have a poet or a bard attached to them to tell their story and to praise them. And as we kind of grew a middle class, these low-level lords were able to do that. They mostly wrote eulogies to great leaders. They provided training and apprenticeships to up-and-coming bards. But something interesting about the literature of this period is they deliberately tried to sound older. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Like if you see the old shop spelled OLDESHOPPE to kind of make it sound like it's Old English, they wanted it to sound like the early poets. So they tried to use archaic spellings, archaic meters and words to kind of, I guess, relate themselves to those earliest poets. And then we have the poets of the nobility, the Cywyddwyr, 1300 to 1600. This is probably the most high-level, sophisticated poetry in the Welsh medieval period. These poets developed the Cywydd meter, and it became hugely popular. At the peak in this period, I think there were 23 significant meters that you could write in. And the more you could write in a poem, the better quality the poem was. So poets were really working on writing very sophisticated and complicated things by that time. All right, so let's go back to the Cynfeirdd, the early poets. The historical Taliesin lived in around the 6th century, about the same time as the historical Arthur. I believe in historical Arthur, so I hope you all do too. At this time, the Welsh not only lived in Wales, but also in the north of England and southern Scotland, as you can see on this map. From about 550 to 650, the Welsh inhabited this whole area, and it was called the Old North. They never forgot it. They always talked about the Old North and remembered that they had once owned all of the British Isles, not just Wales that they got pushed into. This area, about the center of it, is Edinburgh. So anybody who's been to the lowlands of Scotland or the north of England, you'll kind of recognize what that countryside looks like. Taliesin was often referred to as the chief bard, the first bard, the most important bard. He is mentioned in the Historia Brittonum, which was written around 800 as a poet who was famous in the 6th century. So even around the time that Beowulf was written, Wales already had a several hundred years history of famous, skilled poetry. He's associated with the Old North, as is Arthur. Most of the Arthurian legends are probably placed in this area, and that was where they fought the Saxons. So the Book of Taliesin actually comes from the 14th century. And this is a sheet from the manuscript. It's held at the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. You can go and look at it. It's all digitized if you want to see it. There are about 60 poems of many types in this manuscript, but at least 12 of them have been reliably dated to the historical Taliesin in the 6th century. So a lot of these later poems, like we were talking about, they were trying to recall the style and the archaic nature of the Taliesin poems. So they're kind of like copies, I guess, reproductions. But 12 of them at least have been dated to the 6th century. So we're going to mostly look at those, but even 14th century poems are still pretty old and pretty cool. Aneurin is another famous poem from the 6th century. His most important work is a Gododdin, dated to the late 6th century. If I zip back up to that map of the Old North, you can see kind of north central is where the Gododdin tribe lived. So this is the tribe that the poem was written about. The people were called the Gododdin, as was their land. So he was also mentioned with Taliesin in the Historia Brittonum in around 800, but he never became copied and attached to all the other stories like Taliesin did. Taliesin became almost a Merlin-like figure in the stories of the Middle Ages. He became known as a wizard, as a shapeshifter, as somebody who really got involved in history and created it, made it happen. I don't really know why Taliesin was kind of chosen to carry that part of the poetic story, but Aneurin really wasn't, even though they both were in the Old North writing at the same time. The Gododdin tribe lived near modern Edinburgh, and the poem is a series of elegies about the men who died at the Battle of Catraeth. The Battle of Catraeth was between the Welsh and the Saxon invaders. There were 300 men on the Welsh side, and all of them died, except for one who was let live so that he could tell the story. And so each stanza of this poem tells something about each soldier who died in the battle, something about his personality or his bravery or something about his family, a story. So kind of like when we go now to, say, the Vietnam War Memorial, and we have all the names of the fallen, or also had that in Oklahoma City with the bombing memorial. The poem, A Gododdin, was kind of a literary memorial of all the men who died trying to rid Britain of the Saxon menace. Has about 1,300 lines. Stanzas are memories of the different men. And unfortunately, although they had 300 warriors, it was not enough to defeat the Saxons. And as we know, the Norse, Vikings, the Saxons, the Angles, they all came and captured England and southern Scotland and invaded them and pushed the Welsh out to Ireland and Wales. So it was a lost cause, but it is probably the most famous ancient Welsh poem. It's very moving, kind of depressing to read that many stanzas about death, but I think it's a beautiful memory, and I have some copies for everybody to look at in a bit. So some interesting things about the Gododdin. It contains one of the very first mentions of King Arthur. Aneurin the poet praises the bravery of one of the fallen warriors by saying, he was so brave, although he was not Arthur, which I love because that tells us that within a generation after a historical Arthur's death, he was known at the time by the people who lived in the region as somebody of exemplary bravery and character, to the point that they were being compared to him already within a generation. So I think that is really neat. And it shows that he had done things at the time, even though we don't have them, but that made them, the people who knew the stories, think of him as an idol of bravery, a hero. I think it's really fascinating because the Battle of Cattræth took place around 600. The historical Arthur probably lived between 520 and 560. So it's pretty neat that you could be that famous that quickly, that everybody just knew. It also contains a reference to hospitality rules. Prior to battle, when the warriors were called up, kind of like our armies get called up to go serve, they had to go stay with their lord, and he had to feed them, clothe them, give them mead and ale to drink. He had to take care of their families while they were away from them. And if he didn't do all those things for him, for the soldiers, they didn't have to fight for him. They couldn't be forced to fight for him unless he took care of them and their families while they were away, which I think is a pretty modern expectation. It's not really what we would expect in the Middle Ages. Wales was a little bit, I think, more modern than England at this time. It's called the Tali Mev, which means the payment of mead. So we can tell it was most important to the soldiers at the time. As long as they got their mead, they were happy. So after about 1200, we started to get more prose literature. Up until then, it was really documents and poetry. And poetry was always thought of as the most important. Anything that was really valuable, you would commit it to poetry. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think prose is easier to write than poetry. If anybody's ever tried to write a poem, I think poetry is easier to remember. And when you remember that bards had this duty to remember all the genealogy, the law, the history, putting it in a rhythmic metrical form would make it a lot easier to recall, I think. And also, I think they were just considered harder to do and more skilled, and so they tended to get written down and preserved. Since Wales skipped the Germanic invasions, like we talked about, Welsh literature kept developing straight on, straight through from the Bronze Age. So they had some of the most admired and skilled literature in Europe. People wanted to read Welsh stories in France, in Italy, in Germany. That's how King Arthur took over as the most popular topic in the Middle Ages. A Welsh hero, because Welsh poetry and literature was so much better than everybody else's. That's why they wanted to read it. That's why it got traded around to different monasteries and copied and retold in their own languages. So it just kept flourishing. Poetry is still very important in Wales, but prose literature really expanded in the Middle Ages. And the Arthurian romance, also called the Matter of Britain, is a Welsh theme. Camelot, all of that, Sir Gawain, all of the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, these are all Welsh characters. It's a Welsh tradition. So England tried to kind of adopt it as their own tradition, but it's deeply, deeply Welsh. And the idea that a once and future king exists, that is also a Welsh thing. I think it kind of tied in with Christianity when they became Christian, but the idea that a fallen hero could come back in your time of greatest need and help you and save you. So you never are really alone, and your history is going to guide you. Your tradition is going to comfort you, and you can rely on it. I think I think that's one of the most important things that's come through the whole of Welsh literature. So the last thing I want to talk about briefly here, I can come back and talk about it more fully because it is kind of a whole thing, but the Mabinogi. Um, there are a lot of traditional Welsh tales in the Middle Ages, but the Mabinogi is the most famous, the most popular. Strictly speaking, it is a group of four stories called cainc or branches that are linked by being called that. They're called the four branches. If you've read the four stories, you may be hard pressed to find anything else that links them. I do have some ideas, but they are kind of standalone stories. Our earliest version of them is from the 14th century. That's really when manuscripts, literary manuscripts, start surviving in Wales. We don't have much from before the 14th century, but the language and the events they're describing can show that they are dated to a much earlier period. In this case, a lot of the things in the Mabinogi are dated to the triads, which happened in the 6th to the 9th century. So most of the Mabinogi stories, the language is mid-12th century, around 1150, 1170. Some of it dates even further to the 11th century. And all the stories are set in this Arthurian world. They're the stories that got borrowed and copied into French and German and Italian and Spanish and took over Europe. But this is the tradition. It's all Welsh. So that is my talk. I have some poems we can look at if you guys are interested, or we can do some questions.
Diolch yn fawr, Anne. Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and just start with a question that Mary Morgenthau asked. She asks if women were ever poets.
Women were almost certainly poets and storytellers. However, we do not have any, I don't want to say legitimate references to female poets in the Middle Ages. The first kind of writing in this theme was Marie de France, who wrote in an Anglo-Norman language about the Welsh traditional stories. We think she kind of got them through Brittany and the Breton language. But if you read many of the poems, and especially the Mabinogi, the role of women is so strong and so independent and really so modern that it's hard to imagine that a woman didn't have something to do with the writing or the conceiving of that story. Rhiannon especially is such a, I think, the most independent woman written in the Middle Ages period across the board. So I think it does show that women were involved in storytelling, and also that men weren't so angry if a woman had some independence. Didn't really need to beat them down for it. You know, there seemed to be some respect for women that didn't really occur in England.
Are there any other questions that people would like to ask?
Robert?
Yes. Hello. Yes. You're on mute.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for this this wonderful, informative talk. I completely understand why the Bardic chair at the Eisteddfod is so important.
Yes.
I never really knew why.
They had that in the Middle Ages. It's the same thing. Yes.
Okay, and it's so strict. The meter is so strict. Is this correct? That
yes.
They have to write their poem in?
Yes. There are multiple meters, and they are extremely difficult to write in. Very strict.
Okay, that really explains a lot to me. I also was interested to note that Saint David was during this period of time too, because he died in 589, or they think he did.
Yes.
So he was during that time too, then exactly that all this was happening around the 600s.
Yes. It was a very tumultuous time when you think about it. Christianity came in with the
Yes,
Romans. They were all Christians. And then we had all of these barbaric Viking, German, Norse invasions of pagans and
I see.
people who had a completely different culture. But Wales and Ireland kept their culture and their Christianity and their language, so they got to keep growing.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Of course.
So, did you want to share? We have some time. Would you like to share some of the literature?
Sure.
And
Sure.
then if people have any additional questions, they can certainly ask them.
Okay. Let me get to the beginning here. All right. So if we look at this is one of the poems from Taliesin from the 6th century. This he wrote about his patron, Irian, who was a lord or king um, in Britain. Irian of Arachwedd, most generous of Christian men, much do you give to the people of your land. As you gather, so also do you scatter. The poets of Christendom rejoice while you stand. More is the gaiety and more is the glory that Urian and his heirs are for riches renowned, and he is the chieftain, the paramount ruler, the far-flung refuge, first of fighters found. The Floygrians, the English, know it when they count their numbers. Death have they suffered, and many a shame. Their homesteads a burning, stripped their bedding, and many a loss and many a blame, and never a respite from Irian of Freged. Freged's defender, famed lord, your land's anchor, all that is told of you has my acclaim. Intense is your spear play when you hear ploy of battle. When to battle you first come, 'tis a killing you can. Fire in their houses ere day in the Lord of Arachwith's way. Arachwith the beautiful and its generous clan. The Angles are succorless around the fierce king and his fierce offspring. Of those dead, of those living, of those yet to come, you head the column. To gaze upon him is a widespread fear. Gaiety clothes him, the ribald ruler. Gaiety clothes him in riches abounding, gold king of the Northland and of kings king. Until I am old and ailing in the dire necessity of death, I shall not be in my element if I don't praise Irian. So how
Wow.
would you like one of your friends to say this about you?
That's amazing.
Right? I mean, it talks about his generosity, his Christianity, that he gives so much to the people of his land, that the English are terrified of him and they suffer shame. They lose even their bedding,
Mm.
and he never gives them respite. His clan is beautiful. He's fierce, but he's also kind and gay. It's really everything you'd want to be as a medieval king, don't you think?
Definitely.
I think it's quite amazing. Now, the one that his cohort wrote, Aneurin, is called a Gododdin. This is about 1,300 lines, so I just put a few in here to get the idea. But this is the one where each stanza relates to a fallen comrade in the war. Men went to Gododdin, laughter inciting, bitter in battle, with blades set for war. Brief the year they were at peace, the son of Bothgod, by the deeds of his hand did slaughter. Though they went to churches to do penance, the young, the old, the lowly, the strong, true is the tale, death overtook them. Men went to Gododdin with eager laughter, attacking in an army, cruel in battle. They slew with swords without much sound. Raithview, that's who we were just talking about, pillar of battle, took pleasure in giving. Men went to Catrife. Swift was their host. Fresh mead was their feast, their poison too. 300 waging war under command. And after joy, there was silence. Though they went to churches to do penance, true is the tale, death overtook them. So very different type of poem, yes? Um, very somber. Um, you really get the weight that the poets and the people were feeling, the kind of loss. Can you imagine in a village of, say, 1,000, all of their able-bodied men gone, dying to defend them? And this was something they used to commemorate that. So very different. This one's quite long. I think I'll skip to the last one, but you can read that if you like. I will send it along so we can copy it. This is probably the most famous Welsh poem and the most famous Welsh poet, Dafydd ap Gwilym, Merched Llanbaron, or The Girls of Llanbaron, written in the early 14th century. He was a cywydd poet. He was using the cywydd meter, which really became so popular. It's what everybody used. Now, poets by this time are writing more about their interior lives, about their hopes, their fears, their dreams, their experiences. They're not so much looking outward at death or God or those kind of larger nature ideas. This is about David's lack of game with the ladies. David liked to flirt with the girls, and they did not so much like to flirt back. I am bent with wrath, a plague upon all the women of this parish, for I've never had cruel, oppressive longing, a single one of them, neither a virgin, a pleasant desire, nor a little girl, nor hag, nor wife. What hindrance, what wickedness, what failing prevents them from wanting me? What harm could it do to a fine-browed maiden to have me in a dark, dense wood? It would not be shameful for her to see me in a bed of leaves. There was never a time when I did not love. Never was any charm so persistent, even more than men of Garwe's ilk. One or two in a single day, and yet I've come no closer to winning one of these than if she'd been my foe. There was never a Sunday in Llanbaron church, and others will condemn it, that my face was not turned towards the splendid girl and my nape towards the resplendent holy Lord. I am bent with wrath, and after I'd been staring long over my feathers across my fellow parishioners, the sweet, radiant girl would hiss to her companion, so wise, so fair, "He has an adulterous look. His eyes are adept at disguising his wickedness. That pallid lad with the face of a coquette and his sister's hair upon his head. Is that what he has in mind?" says the other girl by her side. "While the world endures, he'll get no response. To hell with him, the imbecile." I was stunned by the bright girl's curse. Meager payment for my stupefied love. I might have to renounce this way of life. Terrifying dreams. Indeed, I'd better become a hermit, a calling fit for scoundrels. Through constant staring, a sure lesson, over my shoulder, a pitiful sight. It has befallen me, who loves the power of verse, to become wry-necked without a mate. So this is, again, an extremely different type of poem. It's all about his feelings and his jealousy and his wondering why, what it is about him that makes the ladies of the parish not want to marry him or even date him. I think we can all kind of feel some of those feelings. The poetry is written through almost conversations in his own mind, I think, which is very sophisticated, but the wording is very down to earth. And the topic is, I think, something that everybody could understand. How frustrating it can be to really want something and not get it and not understand why you can't get it. What do you guys think?
I'd like to add, Anne, that another of his famous poems is Trafferth mewn tafarn, which means trouble at the tavern. And
Yes.
it's about him trying to meet up with a lady he has his eye on in a tavern at night, and he trips over a stool and sets off a huge commotion, and his plans are foiled. And it's quite a comic poem. It's very. I mean, when you think about it too, I mean, Dafydd ap Gwilym is really a sort of contemporary of Geoffrey Chaucer, and it's very comparable in tone and some of the subject matter.
He is. He definitely is. He's a comic. He's making fun of himself, in the best comic tradition. He's clumsy, he's artless, he has no skill, he stares like a fool in the middle of church. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's a very different tone. And I think his poetry really relates well to modern people. I think we all kind of have felt like David sometimes, a little bit awkward, not quite fitting in the way we want to. So yeah, these are some examples. I'll send them off so you guys can have a copy and look at them. And like I say, my email's in the chat box. If anybody thinks of other questions or wants to talk about anything, I'm always willing.
Oh, great.
Yeah, if you send that to me, Anne, I would be happy to share that with anybody who wants to contact me. And I'll put my my email in here.
Greetings to Patagonia. There's another Welsh stronghold.
Could I bring up something a little bit more modern?
Of course.
Yes. Yeah, please do.
I'm Amy Farrell, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather was called Bard Koch, and he has written many poems, or he did write many poems and hymns, and he was a traveling preacher. And we actually found his grave one time. He was born in 1793, and a folk song that's now been attributed to him is very popular. And I don't know Welsh, but the translation is "There is my sweetheart down in the orchard." If that sounds at all familiar, it's
Dachwng Hariad.
Okay.
Dachwng Hariad I lawr yn y berllan.
Okay, my son knows how to sing it and knows how to sing it in Welsh, but I don't. And I once had a whole packet of his hymns and sermons, which my mother had ordered from the National Library in Wales, and with our moves and everything, we've somehow misplaced them. And I don't think they were ever all translated. And so they still have them in the National Library of Wales. His name was Thomas Elias.
Okay, I'm looking it up.
If you
I will definitely.
There's another Thomas Elias too, but this one was called Bard Koch, and he was born in 1793 in Silicon, Carmarthenshire, and died in 14 March 1855 near Senny Bridge. And so it was really interesting that he's right in our line, which is kind of fun.
Isn't that amazing?
Yep. So I always thought this sounded so interesting that we had the Red Bard in our background.
Honestly, I mean, it's still going on. You can go attend Eisteddfod now. I mean, people are still maintaining this tradition. It's as strong as it ever was, and that your great-great-grandfather was a part of that.
I think there's one more great.
You must be so proud.
I think it's kind of neat. Yeah.
It's fascinating. And, they thought that if somebody had the talent for poetry, it passed down. So do you have any talent?
I've written lots of poems, and my son has too. And
there we go.
My mother grew up in Trosveneth in northern Wales, and poetry, they had to memorize lots and lots of poetry. And so they wrote poetry too. So interesting. Thank you so much. This was fun.
Oh, good. Yes. Thank you so much for coming and for your interest.
Thank you. We're in Sarasota, by the way.
Lovely. I love the horse races more than anything else.
It's lovely. No, not Saratoga, Sarasota.
Oh, Sarasota. Okay.
Where we're just recovering from the horrible hurricanes.
Oh, God bless all of you.
It's been really grim. Yeah.
So, wish you good weather.
Our Welsh society keeps going.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to. Oh, sorry.
No.
Okay. I had a couple of closing comments about your talk. I just wanted to mention that I do know of a poet, a female poet of the at the very end of the Middle Ages, really more at the end of Gwerfyl Mechain,
Mm,
um, who was around 1500, who wrote some poems that responded, I think, in some ways to the work of David ap Gwilym, and she may be somebody that people may be interested in looking into. Um,
wow.
and also on the topic of women as poets and storytellers, there is a controversial theory that the four branches of the Mabinogi. I'm sure you've heard of the theory that Princess Gwenllian may have written
Yes.
the four branches.
Yes.
It is personally, I'm very skeptical, and I think most other scholars are. But if anybody is interested in at least a woman of significance in medieval Wales, Gwenllian. Well, there are actually two princesses named Gwenllian who are significant in medieval Welsh history, but this is the Gwenllian of the 12th century,
And
who
they were both fascinating.
supposedly led an army against the Normans. So I think 1135 or around that time.
Mm,
So
that sounds right.
so yes, and some people have actually there is a one scholar who has attributed the four branches of the Mabinogi to her, which is a very, very bold theory.
That's
Um,
extremely bold. But I do think the way the women are written and the detail, I mean, the men are kind of weak and the women are kind of the protagonists of most of the stories. I definitely would have no trouble believing that a woman was deeply involved,
yes,
um,
yeah.
for
Uh,
sure.
I do think that there's definitely a sensitivity to that,
Hmm.
and
And a
the women
respect.
the yeah, so the women play a very significant role, and in many of the stories they seem to be the more stable and rational characters.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So I encourage you all to go read the Mabinogi and read some poetry, and read about Guanxian. I think, gosh, it all just informs what we do today so much too.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you, Anne, for your contribution today. I think everybody feels a little more enlightened and enjoyed what you had to share today about the Welsh tradition of poetry and storytelling in the Middle Ages. This is, of course, a tradition that has continued to the present day, and it has spanned the Atlantic as well and the world. If you come to the Great Plains Welsh Heritage Center in Wymore, Nebraska, we have in our archives, in fact, manuscripts of poetry written by Welsh people living in the United States in the 19th century. And that's one of the things that we try to preserve in our archive for Welsh America. And I am here putting my director hat on to tell you that we are currently trying to raise funds to expand our facility to put more items on display. And so we are in the middle of this capital campaign. We would encourage you to make a donation to that. We're trying to raise $175,000. We have already raised about $60,000 through private donations and grants. We're very excited about actually breaking ground on this as soon as we can reach that $175,000 threshold. I would also encourage you to become members of our organization. And the thing to do, the way to do that and to donate is to go to our website, greatplainswelsh.org. And if you go there, you can make a donation, you can become a member. We welcome not only donations to our expansion, but also donations to our operations fund that help us to in a the daily expenses that are required to keep our custom built archives building operating, and also the to be able to open our doors and host events like this. So I'm going to type in, give you all the email, the web address of the Great Plains Welsh Heritage Centre. Please visit our website. Please, we welcome donations. We would love for you to all become members if you're not already. And you know, we're excited about doing more and expanding. Along those lines too, we have additional events coming up online. In the next Sunday, we will have Dan Robotham, who is he's from Wales. He's currently the director of the Madog Center for Welsh Studies at Rio Grande University in Ohio. He's going to be talking about Welsh immigration and influence on southeastern Ohio. And so he will be here next Sunday at 1 o'clock Central Time. And the following Sunday, the 17th, we have Wyn Thomas. Dr. Wyn Thomas will be speaking to us from Wales. And he is going to be sharing the history of Tryweryn. Some of you are familiar with, no doubt familiar with the flooding of Capel Celyn, whoops, I seem to have disappeared. A village in Wales, and I have the book here, but it doesn't seem to be showing up. But this was something that occurred in 1965 and had a very profound impact on Wales, on Welsh language culture, and in fact, in many ways, helped to revitalize Welsh language culture in Wales. So thank you very much. If nobody has any other questions or comments, I will go ahead and bring this meeting to an end. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Anne. And I look forward to talking to you again, Anne, and maybe you joining us again in the future for another presentation.
I'd love that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you.